A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Dearest respected brothers and sisters, viewers from around the world, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome to Ahlulbayt TV's Muharram special, The Life of Al-Hussain alayhi salam, where, inshallah, in these shows we will be looking at the life of Imam Hussain, starting from his early years, understanding the environment he grew up in, the relationship he had with his family members, his companions, the roles he played in the political system and the social environment of Arabia at the time. But also we will look at his journey towards the Battle of Karbala. We will look at, of course, the battle itself. And inshallah, in this particular episode, we will look more at the life of Sayyidah Zainab, salamullahi alayha, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless her soul. And we will understand the route which Sayyidah Zainab took to the Battle of Karbala, the role she played, and even the aftermath of the battle. What sort of significance and importance did Bibi Zainab play in these tragic times? Brothers and sisters, I'm very honoured and blessed to be joined by Father Christopher Clohesi. Thank you so much for being here, Father. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
For those who are unaware, the Father is Professor of Shia Studies at the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies in Rome. He has, of course, written a book on Sayyidah Fatima named Fatima, Daughter of Muhammad, and he is publishing currently his second book, which looks at the life of Lady Zainab, may Allah bless her, named Half of My Heart. Am I correct?
That's correct.
And inshallah, we look forward to reading that. So thank you for joining us, Father, and for sharing your opinions. Just to begin with, before we kind of look at the role and the life of Bibi Zainab in Karbala particularly, can you tell us a bit about her early years, her upbringing?
Her early years, as I think is probably well known, are quite a mix. I would say primarily quite traumatic. Okay. She loses her grandfather, the Prophet. She then loses, almost immediately after him, by a number of months, her mother, to whom she is deeply attached. Yeah. She then sees the murder of her father, and then she sees the murder also of her brother, Hassan, Al-Hassan, and then she's going to be present at the murder of her other brother, Al-Hussein. So this is huge trauma for a young girl. She would have been present, for example, when the house of Ali and Fatima was besieged, when Fatima was wounded and lost the son she was carrying. Zainab would have seen that as a young girl. She would have witnessed her mother's protest in the masjid when she preaches this famous sermon or protest against the refusal to give her what is her right and her due. And then she would have seen her mother's last days of illness and the enormous grief. So there's a great deal of sadness. But she is also present in this holy house. She is brought up, in a sense, not only by her parents Ali and Fatima, but by her grandfather too, and by her two younger brothers who care for her, two older brothers, they're not younger brothers, who care for her and take charge over her. We know, for example, that Ali would never allow her to go out at night unless she was accompanied by him holding a lamp, and also by one of her brothers. So there's a very close family loving connection, but this terrible trauma of seeing the family torn apart. So it's a very mixed upbringing.
We know, of course, that the respect that her father, Imam Ali, had for her was phenomenal, and particularly the sort of role she played in the religious environment. She was someone who was a figurehead, like her mother, of course, Sayyidah Fatima was, for teaching. That's something we know, that she was an expert jurisprudentially, and even in other elements of Islamic studies, was someone who led in teaching. Is this a correct evaluation of her particularly? And if so, where would she have learned from?
We do certainly know from a number of Shia sources that her father taught her certainly some tafsir, and Quran, and that she was then later, as a young woman, asked if she would do the same for the women of Medina. So she would have groups of women to whom she would teach the same things that her father had taught her. But her own father, it is reported, used to hear her praying and hear her reciting Quran and teaching tafsir. He used to overhear her, and was always hugely impressed with her. Wow. And there's some wonderful anecdote stories about how, for example, she would never say the word two. Her father tried to teach her numbers, and she said, once you've said one, you can't then say 2 or 3.
Why was that the case?
Well, she was thinking of the essentials of Tawheed and this,
I see.
but it was a deep piety and a deep understanding within her, clearly a deep understanding of the oneness of God, and how once one has used the word one to describe God, one cannot then use the word two for anything. So there's one has to try and separate. There are the stories of pious stories of hagiography, which are very important. They're the popular piety about her. Not all of them in the classical texts, some of them in later works. And then, of course, there are the classical texts of hadith, in which we find a fair amount of information. But much of her early life is somewhat lost to us. We begin to see her arising around the time of her mother's death and her father's murder. There are a number of hadith around that. And then she disappears for a while again, and then arises again when the Karbala event begins. Yeah.
Now, it's good you mentioned that, Father, because just kind of going forward a few years, fast-forwarding, her role in the battle itself, pre-battle and, of course, the aftermath as well, is something phenomenal. Before we go into the aftermath and the sort of role she played in the court of Yazid and so on, what sort of significance did she have, for the decisions that were made by Imam Hussain? What sort of relationship did she have with Imam Hussain? Was Imam Hussain someone who was reliant perhaps on his sister? Was she an important figure to take note of?
We know of texts which tell us that when Fatima was dying, she commissioned Zainab to look after her 2 brothers, to care for them and be a mother to them. So she obviously has that role to play. There are other sisters, but they're younger sisters, Kulthum, for example. And I want to stress that it's quite important that I have no doubt that Zainab and Kulthum are 2 separate people, not one single sister, as some have held. And so Zainab certainly plays a motherly figure to Hussein. We know that there were a number of people who tried to dissuade Hussein from going to Karbala, amongst his own followers, people who thought it wasn't a good idea. Zainab apparently was not amongst those, but possibly her husband was. Her husband, perhaps, according to some texts, tried to dissuade him, and perhaps her as well, but she was resolute in following her brother and in whatever the consequences would be. And I think that's quite important, because I'm not convinced that Zainab was fully aware of what the consequences were. I think she understood the earlier visions and dreams and predictions of her brother's death, but I'm not convinced that she was aware at the beginning that it was actually going to be Karbala, the end.
Right, I see.
And I think there's a change of character from a very frightened woman in the pre-Karbala days. On the field of Karbala, there's a transformation from this, and we can talk about it because it's an interesting subject, from this terrified, uncertain woman to one who challenges those who are killing her brother. Is there not a Muslim among you, she says to them. And then this hugely powerful woman after Karbala.
So, I mean, you mentioned the role of Lady Zainab in Karbala and the battle, of course. Let's dissect that, and I'd like to get into a bit of detail about that. So she, of course, was of those, the women folk in the family, the children who remained at the tents when, of course, the family members would go out and fight. She was, of course, someone who Imam Hussain would consult and would come to every time someone was martyred. He would call upon his sister, tell her what had happened. Her role itself was behind the scenes during the battle itself. Was it an influential role? Did she have any bearing on the actual events of the battle?
I wouldn't necessarily go with behind the scenes. I think that you could say that perhaps of Kulthum, her sister, and the others, even of Zain al-Abidin, who is sickly and is unable to play a role. So I followed the chronology of At-Tabari, because his chronology of the battle is quite a good one and fairly reliable, and he draws on much earlier works that are Abu Mikhnaf, for example, which are very important. And there are definite moments. There's the pre-Karbala event where, for example, Zainab hears voices on the night air. This is a very popular theme. Often it's the jinn who are lamenting the death of Hussein or predicting. And so the pre-Karbala Zainab is with her brother and she's terrified. She keeps breaking down, she's frightened, she's tearful, and he has to keep consoling her. At one stage, Zain al-Abidin, who is sitting with her, says she is a woman. She is reacting as a woman will. He understands this of his aunt. And then the battle begins at whatever time it begins in the morning, and on at least 3 occasions, Zainab leaves her tent and comes onto the battlefield, into the most dangerous part of the battle. The first time she does it to lament the murder of her nephew. And now this is the oldest son of Al-Hussein, who is killed. And she comes out of her tent, and we are told by the authors, she looked like the rising sun.
Wow.
So this is a very different woman from the night before.
Of course.
And she laments, and she is led back to her tent by her brother. She comes out a second time to chase after a boy. And we're not sure who he was. It may have been a nephew. But she chases after him because he's left the tent determined to fight. Al-Hussein orders her to bring him back to the tent, but she can't. He says, I will not be separated from my uncle, and dies next to his uncle as a very young boy. And then she laments that. And then she emerges a third time at the very moment that Hussein is being killed. And he is killed with great reluctance. None of the soldiers seem eager to be the ones who kill him, and they have to be harangued and ordered on by their commanders. So you have this dreadful Shimmer, for example, and the others who are with him. And she challenges them and says, is there not a Muslim among you? So she's present at the moment of the death. And then possibly before that, some authors think she was also present when the youngest boy was killed, but we're not so sure about that.
Sorry to interrupt, Father. Would you argue, or would you state perhaps that the events which unfolded on this day would not have gone the way it had done so had she not been there prior to the battle, or indeed on the day itself?
Look, I'm not certain. She certainly played a massive role in her brother's life.
Right.
He was determined to protect the women and children, so their tents are in the rear and they are guarded. And there's one moment when the tents are threatened, somebody threatens to set them on fire, and Hussein is horrified that the enemy would do that. She certainly is his major support. He's got 2 major supports on that day. I mean, besides the other great figures who are dying around him, he's got his son, the new Imam, and he's got his sister, his sister Zainab. And these are 2 major supports. And he does everything he can to protect them and to make sure that they're all right. So in that sense, she certainly plays a battle, but it's her challenge as well to those killing her brother, which is an important challenge, that it's unlike a woman to do this, to enter the thick of battle. And there were some women, I think, who fought at Karbala, but Hussein tried to stop them. He didn't want the women fighting. But she entered at least 3 times into the worst moments of the battle. Great danger. And protests loudly and laments loudly.
Father, we know, kind of moving on from the battle now, as soon as the battle had taken place, as soon as she had seen her martyred brother on the floor, immediately the family of the Ahlulbayt, the family of Al-Hussein were tormented, they were captured, and the journey to Sham had begun to the court of Yazid. Now, what role did Zainab play amongst all the women and children? And of course, Imam Zain al-Abidin, who you mentioned already, was not too well at the time and didn't fight. Was she a significant leader, a figurehead amongst that group, or just...
So it was 3 days between the death of Hussein and the women and the children being led off from the battle. About 3 days. And in those 3 days, she begins to play the role of matriarch. She is really... And I mean, I'm not a Shia or a Muslim, so I can be a little edgy here. She really is the leader of the whole of Shia Islam. There's no one else. You have the Imam, of course, and he seems to have been delegated, and in my book, I picked out a moment that I thought was the moment of nas, of delegation. But she's the leader in those, how many days? The 3 days, 2 or 3 days before they leave, the journey to Kufa, however long that journey takes, to the court of Ziyad, the events that happen in that court before this very mentally unstable man, Ziyad. He was mentally unstable, there's no doubt about this. And then they get sent on a second journey. Now, however long that journey took, she is the matriarch, and she is the leader of the family. There is no one else. She gathers all the women, the younger daughters and girls, the boys who survived. There may have been other boys besides Zain al-Abidin, young boys, but she is the mother of the Ahlulbayt at that moment.
At the moment where, of course, she was in the court of Yazid, and we know that she delivered a powerful sermon, a sermon which resembled the likeness of her father, Ali ibn Abi Talib, alayhi salam. And we know, of course, that the approach she had taken was one which was firm without being aggressive, but one which was steadfast in the mission which her brother had set out to do. What is your perception of this sermon? Was it something which is significant in this history?
It is a terrifying sermon. You can barely believe when you read it that anybody, man or woman, would stand up in front of someone like Yazid, who, like Ziyad, is a man who, well, he's drifting between great regret.
Yeah.
I think he's panicking of what's happened, and also his arrogant pride. And if you read the sermon carefully, she basically accuses him of committing a sin worse than shirk.
Okay.
Because she quotes a Quranic verse which suggests that what he's done is worse than giving God a partner. And there can't be a worse sin than shirk. She says there is. The killing of Hussain. I suspect that he was a little more sympathetic than Ziyad, but this sermon mocks his leadership, laughs at his power, which is an earthly power. The Yazid model of power is one of using oppression and force, whereas the Husseini model is one of standing for justice.
Yeah.
And I keep maintaining that the reason that Zainab won and was able to preach this sermon was not because she was fearless, but because she was speaking the truth.
I see.
She was frightened, even in the court of Ziyad and in the court of Yazid, she has moments of breakdown, but she had truth on her side.
Yeah.
And if you have the truth on your side and you speak the truth to power, you eventually are victorious. And there is no doubt that Yazid backs down from her. He could easily have her killed, and he doesn't. There's a moment where Ziyad is going to have her killed. The text says he began to have bad thoughts about her and has to have an intervention to stop him from killing her. So it's clear that these men would have killed her. Something stops Yazid, and I have no doubt it's because he recognized, whether he liked it or not, that she was speaking the truth.
Do you think that perhaps the reason for his drifting away and trying not to was it a case perhaps where he wouldn't want to be seen as someone who was weak because she was a lady? Do you think had it been another member of the family, let's say for argument's sake, Imam Zain al-Abidin, who had delivered that sermon, turn of events would have been different?
Well, certainly Ziyad attempts to have Zain al-Abidin killed, and he relents when Zainab intervenes. So we know that they would have killed him. Yazid had a strange fixation with Zain al-Abidin. He kept inviting him to meals. In fact, Tabari says he wouldn't eat unless Zain was there with him. He develops a strange fixation with this boy. He mocks him and questions him, but and when they're leaving, when he sends them back to Medina, he tells Zain al-Abidin, anything you need, tell me. I suspect that Yazid is repentant, that or at least he is realizing that he's done something really terrible, and he's scrabbling to make up. Kulthum says of him, I have never met any of the kuffar as kind as Yazid. So she's damning him as kuffar, but she's saying he was kind to us, whereas Ziyad was a monster. He was just... Yazid tries to shield the woman from the head of Hussein. Ziyad makes no such effort. He just wants them to be traumatized. So I suspect, yes, he was backpedaling fast to make up for what he'd done.
Father, talking in today's day and age, 21st century kind of society, I know we're short on time, but just very quickly, when we evaluate, we analyze and assess the life of Lady Zainab, the morals, the values, and the lessons she stood for, the conviction she had in God, as well as the message of justice and truth. What lessons can we pick up today, be us Muslims or not Muslims, whether we are people who believe in the oneness of God or not? Are there elements of lessons we can learn? Are there humanitarian values there?
Look, Zainab and Hussein both transcend religious and cultural boundaries. They are archetypal figures of those who, in every generation, stand for justice in the face of great danger. So they're beyond religion in a sense. I think that one of the reasons I wrote the book about Zainab was because I wanted to rediscover the real Zainab, not the fearless revolutionary and not the weeping woman, but something in between, because you want Zainab to be a model for ordinary people like myself. I'm not involved in political revolutions, and I occasionally have to take a stand for justice, but they're not dramatic. I still need a model, and I need to see Zainab serving as a model for ordinary, everyday people, not just for those involved in the severe battles, but those in the battle of daily life. And so if we can recapture this picture of a woman who had moments of great fear, but moments of great courage because she spoke the truth, we would have discovered the real Zainab. And in this, she is the one who made sure the message of Karbala would never be forgotten. She is the first preacher of Karbala and of the message of Hussain, no doubt. And she continues, therefore, her voice continues to resonate in people's lives. And she can be and is a model for ordinary, everyday people who have to make little moral decisions every day and are fearful of what people might think of them or what their friends might say. Zainab is the model for that.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much, Father. Unfortunately, we are short on time, so we have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Father Christopher Clohessy. Brothers and sisters, as always, it's a pleasure to be joining you to discuss the martyrdom, the tragedy, the life of Imam Hussain, and in this particular episode, the life of Sayyidah Zainab salamullahi alayha. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to learn more about the Battle of Karbala, but also to use this as an example for ourselves in this contemporary day and age, to learn from, to reform, and to instill a society of goodness, to instill values of humanitarianism, which are so critical in today's day and age. Brothers and sisters, I send you my condolences on these tragic nights of commemoration, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless you all, and inshallah we will see you for the next episode. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
يا حسين